Sometimes the scariest stories don't come from horror movies. They come from real life, from a place where the system we're supposed to trust gets twisted against the very people it's meant to protect. And this one, well, it starts on an ordinary night in a small American city, the kind of night where you wouldn't expect anything unusual to happen. Picture this. A black woman named Danielle Carter, 32 years old, smart, professional, just driving home in her navy blue Lexus after finishing a long assignment out of town. Nothing flashy, nothing reckless. She wasn't speeding, she wasn't weaving, she wasn't doing anything that would catch attention. But still, she noticed the glow of red and blue lights flickering in her rearview mirror. At first, she thought maybe the cops were heading somewhere else. But no, they were tailing her, getting closer until the siren chirped, and she had no choice but to pull over. Two white officers stepped out, cool as can be, with that swagger of people who already know how the night's going to end. "License and registration," one of them said, not even bothering to explain why she was stopped. Danielle asked the obvious question. "What did I do?" The cop didn't answer. He just repeated the demand, sharper this time. Now here's the thing. Danielle wasn't just some random woman. She worked in government contracting, a cover job that hid something far more secretive. But she wasn't about to reveal that to a couple of patrol cops in the middle of the night. She played it calm, professional, respectful, gave them her license, her registration, everything by the book. And yet, within minutes, everything spiraled. One of the officers told her to step out of the car. The other circled around back. And that's when it happened. He bent down, ducked out of sight for just a moment, then came up holding a tiny plastic bag, white powder glinting under the streetlight. "Looks like we got ourselves a trafficker," he said with a smirk. Danielle froze. She knew that bag hadn't been in her car. She hadn't touched drugs in her life. But in that moment, none of that mattered. The cops slapped cuffs on her wrists, tight enough to leave bruises, and shoved her toward the squad car. The neighbors, peeking from their windows, saw only what the officers wanted them to see. A black woman arrested with drugs. At the station, things got even worse. She was booked, fingerprinted, photographed, treated like she was already guilty. And the charge? Possession with intent to distribute. In other words, drug smuggling. A felony that could ruin her life forever. But what those officers didn't know, what no one in that station knew, was that Danielle wasn't helpless. She had resources, allies, and training far beyond what they imagined. And when the truth finally reached the courtroom, it didn't just rattle a few cops. It shook the entire system. When Danielle Carter pulled over on the side of that quiet suburban road, she thought the worst thing that might happen was a ticket, maybe a warning, maybe some attitude from the cops. But what unfolded over the next few hours, it felt like something ripped from a nightmare. You've seen those police shows on TV, right? The way they flip the flashlight into someone's eyes, the sharp commands, the hint of suspicion before a single question is even answered. That's exactly what Danielle got. The first cop, Officer Ryan Hale, leaned in with his hand resting on the butt of his gun, shining the beam right into her face. The second one, Officer Derek Collins, hovered nearby, scanning her car like a hawk. "Ma'am, you failed to come to a complete stop back there at the light," Hale said, his voice clipped, cold. Danielle knew that was a lie. She had been meticulous, almost exaggeratedly cautious. She'd checked her speed, used every signal, stopped exactly where she was supposed to, but arguing with him on the side of a dark street? That wasn't going to help her, so she played it cool, answered politely, gave them her paperwork. But here's the detail that stuck in her mind, the way Hale's eyes flicked at her government ID. He paused, like he noticed something unusual, then quickly masked it with a smirk. That was the first red flag. "Step out of the vehicle," Collins ordered. Danielle asked why. Collins didn't answer. He just repeated the command, sharper this time, while Hale's hand inched even closer to his holster. So she did what she was trained to do. Comply. Keep her voice steady. Keep her body language non-threatening. But inside, her pulse was hammering. They guided her toward the back of the car. Hale disappeared for a second, bent down near the driver's seat, then popped up with a triumphant grin. He held out a little Ziploc bag. White powder. "Well, well, well," he drawled. "Look what we got here!" Danielle's heart sank. That wasn't hers. She knew it. They knew it. But in the eyes of the law, 2 cops swearing under oath would always outweigh one black woman's word. "Those aren't mine," she said firmly. Her voice didn't shake. She wanted the neighbors peeking through their curtains to hear her. She wanted the body camera on Hale's chest to pick up every syllable. But Hale only chuckled. "You accusing me of planting evidence?" And just like that, click. The cuffs snapped shut, biting into her wrists so tightly that her fingers went numb. They shoved her into the back of the cruiser. And as the car pulled away, she caught a glimpse in the side mirror. Hale and Collins smacking palms together in a quick, smug high five. Like this was a game. Like humiliating her was some kind of prize. At the precinct, the humiliation kept coming. The desk sergeant barely looked at her before sliding a stack of forms across. Mugshots, fingerprints, her belongings sealed into a plastic bag. The charge? Possession with intent to distribute. Now, in legal terms, that's not just you had drugs. That's you were planning to sell drugs. A felony. Something that could land her in prison for years. They tossed her into a holding cell with peeling paint and a metal bench that stank of bleach. The door clanged shut, and the sound echoed in her bones. For the first time that night, she let her shoulders sag, let the mask drop. But only for a moment. Because Danielle wasn't the kind of woman who stayed broken for long. What the cops didn't know, what they couldn't even imagine, was that Danielle Carter wasn't just a project manager for some government contractor. That was the surface story, the one she carried around like a business card. Underneath that cover, she had another life. Years of specialized training, years of keeping secrets that could topple governments, years of learning how to notice the small things, like how Hale's pocket bulged before he leaned into her car, and how it didn't after he came back out holding that little bag. In that cell, Danielle sat up straight again. Her mind shifted gears. She catalogued everything, names, badge numbers, the exact words exchanged, the subtle glances between Hale and Collins, the neighbors who'd peeked through their blinds, every detail filed away in perfect order. And then, when the officer on duty finally muttered, "One phone call," Danielle knew exactly what number to dial. She didn't call her family. She didn't call some random lawyer from the Yellow Pages. She called a secure line. To anyone listening, it sounded like a distressed woman calling her cousin for bail money. But hidden in those words were codes, signals, coordinates. And miles away, in a quiet government office with no windows, a phone rang. Someone picked up. And with just a few sentences, they understood. An operative was compromised. That was the beginning of a counterstrike that would turn a simple drug bust into a storm that ripped through an entire city. And by the time it reached the courtroom, the twist waiting for those officers and for the whole justice system was something no one saw coming. By sunrise, the story of Danielle Carter was already being written in police files. Black female, 32, charged with possession with intent to distribute cocaine. To the officers who booked her, she was just another statistic, another win for their record, another checkmark on the board. But that story, the one on paper, wasn't the real one. Let me take you behind the curtain for a second. Danielle's official life was neat, respectable. A government contractor working on logistics consulting. You know, the kind of job title that sounds boring enough for people not to ask too many questions. She lived in a sleek condo downtown, drove a nice car, and paid her taxes early. Nothing flashy. But her other life? That's the part almost nobody knew about. Not her neighbors, not her co-workers, not even her closest friends. Because the truth was, Danielle was an undercover asset for an intelligence agency. Not the CIA exactly, but something adjacent. A contractor with special clearances. A woman trained to spot danger, to gather intel, and to survive in hostile territory. So when those cops thought they were arresting a random black woman in a nice car, they had no idea who they were messing with. In that holding cell, Danielle had already activated a silent alarm. The phone call she placed, it was coded. She said she was calling her cousin in Baltimore to cover her bail. What she really said was, agent compromised, location secured, immediate extraction not required, but backup essential. 4 hours later, while she sat through the monotony of arraignment, a woman showed up with a cashier's check for bail. She introduced herself as Danielle's aunt. She wasn't. She was a field contact, the kind of ordinary person who existed only to step in when agents needed a believable cover story. On the paperwork, it looked like family helping family. In reality, it was the agency pulling its strings. Now here's where the story bends. Danielle's handler, let's call him Clark, called her as soon as she was out. His voice was calm, clipped, the way all handlers sound when they're pretending not to be worried. "Walk away," he told her. "The agency can get the charges buried quietly. You'll keep your cover. You'll stay protected." But Danielle wasn't having it. "No," she said, "this isn't just about me. Those officers didn't pick me by accident. They've been running this scam on other people too. People without my resources. People who can't fight back. If I let this slide, how many more lives get wrecked?" Clark sighed. "It's not our jurisdiction." Her reply was sharp, like steel. "It became our jurisdiction the moment they targeted me." That was Danielle in a nutshell. She wasn't built to back down. So she went to work. Back in her condo, Danielle pressed her palm against a hidden panel in her walk-in closet. The wall shifted open, revealing a compact but sophisticated command room. Computers, encrypted drives, files, screens with feeds most people wouldn't even know how to access. She sat down, rolled her shoulders back, and started digging. Within an hour, she had pulled up the personnel files for Officers Ryan Hale and Derek Collins. Complaints against them? Plenty. All filed away as unfounded. Traffic stops with minorities in wealthy neighborhoods? A pattern. Arrests that seemed a little too clean, too convenient? Dozens. She cross-referenced those with court records, and that's when her stomach turned. Guilty pleas, guilty pleas, guilty pleas. People who couldn't fight back. People who were told, take the deal or risk 10 years. And the prosecutor who signed off on almost all of those cases? Assistant DA Mark Hensley, same man now building the case against her. But Danielle knew she couldn't do this alone. She needed a team, off the books, but effective. Her first call was to Tina Zhao, a tech genius she'd worked with overseas. Tina was on leave, officially working a cybersecurity startup out in San Francisco. Danielle didn't even need to explain much. "Those bastards planted drugs." Tina's voice snapped through the line. "Say less. Send me the data. I'll burn their records wide open." Second call went to Marcus Bell, a defense attorney with a reputation for fighting dirty cops. He'd been a prosecutor once until he quit after watching too many crooked cases slide through. He answered the phone with a gravelly, "Carter? Thought you vanished into the bureaucratic void." "I need representation," she said simply. "But I also need someone willing to fight past the first layer of lies." There was a pause, then a low chuckle. "Most people take a plea deal and pray. You sound like you want war." "I want justice." And just like that, the War Council was formed. Meanwhile, back at the precinct, officers Hale and Collins were already bragging. To them, Danielle's arrest was just another notch on their belts. Overheard in the locker room, one of them said, "Did you see her face when I pulled that bag out? Priceless." The other laughed. "That's 3 this month. Easy convictions. Keeps the streets clean." They had no clue, because while they joked, Danielle and her team were tracing financial records, combing through surveillance cameras, and pulling threads that led to something much bigger than a single arrest. And in a wood-panelled office downtown, ADA Mark Hensley was preparing his case with smug confidence. He'd walked into court 100 times before with cops backing his story and juries eating out of his hand. To him, Danielle Carter was just another defendant who'd eventually fold. But not this time, because Danielle wasn't just preparing for trial. She was preparing to expose an entire system. And when the curtain lifted in that courtroom, the twist waiting for Hensley, Hale and Collins would shake more than their careers. It would shake the city itself. When Danielle Carter walked into the county courthouse for the first time, the building itself seemed to whisper against her. You know those old courthouses, the marble floors that echo with every step, the wood-panelled walls that look more like a church than a hall of justice. It's supposed to feel solemn, respectable, but for Danielle, it felt like a machine designed to grind her down. At the prosecution's table sat ADA Mark Hensley, sharp suit, slicked back hair, the kind of man who loved to smirk for the jury. He stacked his papers with theatrical confidence, like he'd already won. Behind him sat officers Hale and Collins, polished, pressed, and smiling just enough to look like heroes. Danielle took her seat beside her lawyer, Marcus Bell. He was calm, collected, with that old prosecutor swagger that said he knew exactly how the other side thought. He leaned over and whispered, "Let them think they're winning. The bigger the stage they build, the harder they'll fall." The judge, an older man with silver hair and tired eyes, called the case. State versus Danielle Carter. Charge, possession with intent to distribute. The words landed heavy. A felony, prison time, a ruined career. Hensley stood first. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is a straightforward case. 2 experienced officers conducted a lawful traffic stop. They discovered a significant quantity of cocaine under the driver's seat. The evidence is clear. The testimony is consistent. The law is unambiguous." He gestured toward Danielle like she was just another file folder on his desk. "The defendant will try to distract you with excuses. Don't be fooled." Then it was Marcus's turn. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't pace the room. He just looked at the jury and said, "This isn't a case about drugs. It's about power. It's about whether men with badges can plant evidence, lie under oath, and destroy innocent lives because they believe no one will stop them. The evidence will show that Danielle Carter didn't commit a crime. She was the victim of one." The first few witnesses were routine. A lab tech confirming the powder was cocaine, a clerk verifying chain of custody. Nothing shocking. But then, Officer Ryan Hale took the stand. In his uniform with his yes sir, no sir routine, he looked like the picture of reliability. He told the jury the same story he'd told 100 times before. That Danielle had been nervous, that she was evasive, that based on his training, He suspected criminal activity, that the drugs were hidden in a place only a trafficker would use. When Marcus cross-examined, his tone was casual, almost friendly. "Officer Hale, when exactly did you activate your body camera during this stop?" "As soon as I approached the vehicle, per policy," Hale said smoothly. Marcus raised his eyebrows. "Interesting, because the footage begins several minutes later, after you'd already had contact with Ms. Carter. Can you explain the gap?" "Technical malfunction," Hale answered, without missing a beat. Marcus nodded, like he accepted it. But he wasn't done. "And in your career, Officer Hale, how many complaints have been filed against you for racial profiling?" The prosecutor leapt up. "Objection! Irrelevant and prejudicial." "Sustained," the judge ruled. But the seed had been planted. The jury shifted in their seats. Next came Officer Collins. His story lined up perfectly with Hale's, almost too perfectly. He added little details about Danielle's supposed shaking hands and nervous laughter. It sounded rehearsed. Marcus let him talk, then leaned forward. "Officer Collins, you testified that Ms. Carter was uncooperative, but in your report you described her as compliant. Which is it?" Collins blinked, caught off guard. "She was both. Argumentative, but compliant." "A remarkable combination," Marcus said dryly, letting the jury hear the sarcasm. And here's where things got interesting. Because while all this played out in the courtroom, Danielle's ally, Tina Zhao, was running her own war from behind a keyboard. She'd hacked into traffic cameras near the stop, cross-referencing timestamps, piecing together a clearer picture. What she found was damning. Footage showing Hale pulling something from his pocket before he leaned into Danielle's car. She packaged the clip, encrypted it, and sent it to Marcus with the subject line, "Play this when they least expect it." The next day, the defense called their first witness, Danielle herself. She walked to the stand with her posture military straight, her eyes steady. She told the jury, "I stopped at every light. I signaled every turn. I asked why I was being pulled over and never got an answer. And when that officer claimed he found drugs in my car, I told him then, and I tell you now, that evidence was planted." Hensley sneered during cross-examination. "Ms. Carter, if you're so innocent, why not just take a plea deal? Why fight so hard?" Danielle leaned in slightly, her voice clear. "Because if I stay quiet, they'll keep doing this. Not just to me, to anyone who looks like me." Silence swept the room. But the real earthquake was still coming. Marcus waited until the final minutes of his cross-examination of Collins. Then he slid a laptop onto the evidence table and connected it to the courtroom monitor. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, I'd like to play supplemental video evidence we received under subpoena." The screen lit up, grainy at first, then sharpening. The footage showed Hale leaning into Danielle's car, his right hand clearly slipping into his jacket pocket. And then, seconds later, pulling out that little bag of powder. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. A juror covered her mouth. Hale's face drained of color. Collins stared straight ahead, jaw tight. "Objection!" Hensley barked. "This footage wasn't disclosed." "It was," Marcus cut in smoothly. "Filed 3 days ago. Receipt acknowledged by the prosecution's office. Page 36 of your own docket, Counselor." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Overruled. The jury will consider the evidence." And just like that, the room shifted. What had seemed like an open and shut case now looked rotten to the core. But Danielle and her team weren't finished, because hidden behind that single clip was a much deeper truth. Tina's digging had uncovered dozens of messages between Hale and Collins, texts about easy busts, about keeping the neighborhoods clean, about showing these people they don't belong. It was more than corruption. It was a system. And Danielle was about to expose every inch of it. Courtrooms have a strange rhythm. One moment they're quiet enough to hear the scratch of a pen. The next, they're alive with murmurs, gasps, and the shuffle of feet as people lean forward to catch every word. That day, the day Danielle Carter's trial took a turn no one saw coming, the room was electric. The jury had just watched the footage of Officer Hale pulling the bag of cocaine from his jacket pocket. For a second, the whole trial paused in stunned silence. Then, whispers rippled through the gallery. You could almost hear the thought on everyone's mind, "Oh my God, they really planted it." Prosecutor Mark Hensley tried to recover. He called the footage misleading, claimed it was taken out of context, insisted the defense was playing tricks. But the damage was done. The jurors looked rattled. Some of them were even glaring at Hale and Collins, like they were starting to see through the uniforms. Marcus Bell, Danielle's lawyer, leaned back in his chair, calm as a poker player who knows he's holding the winning hand. But Danielle herself sat perfectly still, because she knew this was only the beginning. The next witness Marcus called was unexpected. Dr. Evelyn Grant, a digital forensics expert from Quantico. Grey suit, calm demeanor, the kind of person juries instinctively trust. She swore in, took the stand, and confirmed the traffic camera footage was authentic, unaltered, and showed precisely what it appeared to show. Hale shifted uncomfortably. Collins clenched his jaw. And then Marcus said, "Your Honor, the defense would like to call Danielle Carter, not as the defendant, but as an expert witness." You could feel the shock ripple through the courtroom. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Proceed carefully, Mr. Bell." Danielle walked to the stand. Her presence was different now, not the posture of someone accused, but of someone stepping into authority. She swore in, sat down, and met the jury's eyes. "Ms. Carter," Marcus began, "could you explain to the court your professional background?" Danielle paused, then said it plainly. "I am a covert operations officer contracted by the U.S. intelligence community. My specialty is anti-corruption and counterintelligence." The room exploded. Gasps, shouts. Even the judge had to bang his gavel for order. Hale's face went pale. Collins froze. And Mark Hensley, his smirk was gone, replaced by open panic. Marcus continued, "Ms. Carter, did your training provide you with methods to detect misconduct and preserve evidence in hostile environments?" "Yes," Danielle answered calmly. "My vehicle was equipped with multiple concealed recording devices. They captured both video and audio of the stop. 6 cameras, all synchronized with timestamp verification." At a nod from Marcus, the monitors flickered on again. This time, the footage came from inside Danielle's car. And there it was. Hale's hand, clear as day, pulling a small bag from his pocket and sliding it beneath the driver's seat. The jury gasped again. Someone in the gallery whispered, "Jesus Christ." Danielle continued, her voice steady. "I also observed multiple procedural violations. Officer Hale fabricated a traffic violation. He searched my vehicle without probable cause, and he deliberately manipulated evidence." "Why didn't you reveal your status as an intelligence officer during the stop?" Marcus asked. Danielle leaned forward. "Because my orders are clear. I may only reveal my affiliation in life-threatening situations, and because I wanted the misconduct fully documented, the way it happens to ordinary citizens who don't have the protection I do. I wanted the truth recorded, not erased." The courtroom was silent now. Everyone hung on her words. Then Marcus dropped the final card. "Ms. Carter, Do you have any knowledge of why you were specifically targeted? Danielle's gaze shifted toward Hale. Her voice sharpened. Yes. 3 years ago, I participated in an operation that resulted in the arrest of Michael Hale, Officer Hale's brother, for trafficking stolen military equipment. Records show Officer Hale accessed restricted databases to identify me. He waited for an opportunity to retaliate. The room erupted again. Hale's mask cracked. He slammed a fist against the table and shouted, "She doesn't belong in our neighborhoods!" The judge's gavel banged furiously. "Order! Order in this courtroom!" But it was too late. The damage was irreversible. Hale's words hung in the air like poison. The jurors had heard his prejudice loud and clear. Marcus let the silence stretch, then said quietly, "No further questions, Your Honor." Hensley tried to salvage what he could during cross-examination, but every question made things worse. Danielle parried him calmly, logically, exposing the fragility of his case. Finally he muttered, "No further questions," and slumped into his chair. That was the day the trial stopped being about Danielle Carter. It became about the system itself. Because while Danielle testified, Tina Zhao was feeding Marcus new files, encrypted text messages between Hale and Collins, messages where they bragged about easy busts in wealthy neighborhoods, about keeping the riffraff out, about racking up convictions like candy. Marcus read a few aloud. The jury looked disgusted. Even the judge's face hardened. But the real hammer fell when Internal Affairs investigator Michael Reeves appeared in the gallery. He'd been building a secret case against Hale and Collins for months, blocked by bureaucracy. Now, with Danielle's evidence, he stepped forward. Quietly, unofficially, he slipped Marcus a folder. Inside, records of complaints buried, witnesses intimidated, supervisors looking the other way. By the end of the day, Judge Thompson announced a recess. His voice was tight, almost shaken. "This court will reconvene tomorrow. Until then, Officers Hale and Collins are remanded into custody pending review." The gavel came down like a thunderclap. Reporters scrambled from the room, phones buzzing. The story was already exploding across the city. 2 decorated officers accused of planting evidence. Victim revealed as intelligence operative. For Danielle, it was vindication, but also risk. Her cover was shredded. The agency would not be happy. She knew calls were already being made, decisions debated behind closed doors. But she also knew this. Once the truth was out, it couldn't be buried again. And the fallout was only beginning. The day Danielle walked out of that courthouse as a free woman, it should have felt like the end of the nightmare. But really, it was the beginning of something much bigger. What had started as a single drug charge against a black woman driving home late at night was now spiraling into the kind of scandal that could take down an entire department. The morning after her acquittal, the courthouse looked like a different place. Reporters crowded the steps, cameras flashing every time Danielle appeared. Protesters carried signs with messages like "Stop framing us" and "Justice for all." Families of past defendants held up photographs of loved ones who'd been convicted under suspiciously similar circumstances. People who had once been ignored or dismissed now had a name and a face to point to. Danielle Carter, the woman who stood her ground. Inside, Officers Ryan Hale and Derek Collins no longer carried themselves like heroes. They weren't sitting proud in pressed uniforms anymore. They were shackled, flanked by federal marshals, their badges gone, their faces tight with fear. The jury that had once nodded along to their stories now looked at them with open distrust. What had felt like an open and shut case had been ripped open to reveal something rotten. And it wasn't just those two officers. Federal investigators started digging, and what they found was staggering. Danielle's ally in internal affairs, Michael Reeves, had tried for months to expose the pattern. Now he finally had the backing he needed. Subpoenas went out, pulling phone records, body cam logs, and bank statements. Within weeks, the picture came into focus. Hale and Collins hadn't just framed Danielle. They had orchestrated more than a dozen arrests just like hers, almost all against minorities driving through wealthy neighborhoods. The arrests always looked neat, the evidence always turned up in the same way, and the convictions were almost guaranteed because their word carried more weight than anyone else's. For years, prosecutors like Assistant DA Mark Hensley had signed off on these cases without asking questions. Some defendants took plea deals because they were scared of facing longer sentences. Others fought, only to be crushed by the system. Their voices had been drowned out, until Danielle's case forced people to listen. Community outrage grew, marches shut down streets downtown, past victims came forward, each with the same story. They'd been stopped without reason, accused without cause, and told the evidence was undeniable. Their lives had been upended, families broken, reputations destroyed. Now, finally, someone believed them. The deeper investigators went, the uglier it got. It turned out Hale and Collins weren't just bad apples, they were part of an unofficial departmental strategy whispered about as neighborhood integrity. The unspoken rule was to keep wealthy, predominantly white neighborhoods safe by discouraging outsiders. How do you discourage them? You stop them, you search them, and if nothing sticks, you make something stick. Supervisors knew, some even encouraged it. Arrest numbers went up, promotions followed, overtime pay increased. It was all part of the machine. When the evidence started stacking too high to ignore, Derek Collins broke. He cut a deal, testifying that their captain, James Reynolds, had been the one pushing them to maintain the standard. He listed lieutenants and sergeants who buried complaints, intimidated witnesses, and covered up discrepancies in reports. Suddenly, this wasn't about two cops anymore. It was about an entire command staff. Federal agents raided the precinct. Computers were seized, records hauled out in boxes, hard drives bagged and tagged. Within weeks, 4 high-ranking officials were indicted. And Ryan Hale? He refused to bend. In court, stripped of his badge, he raged. He shouted that they had done nothing wrong, that they were protecting their community, that Danielle was the real problem for daring to drive where she didn't belong. The words came out venomous, filled with the same hatred he'd tried to keep hidden, and the jury heard every syllable. It sealed his fate. He wasn't just guilty of planting evidence. He was guilty of weaponizing his badge against the very people he was sworn to protect. Danielle, meanwhile, should have been celebrating. The charges were gone. Her name was cleared. Strangers stopped her on the street to thank her, to tell her she gave them courage. But victory came with a cost she couldn't ignore. Her cover story as a government contractor was blown wide open. Too many people knew her face, her background, her real line of work. The agency couldn't risk sending her back into the field now. For a while, that ate at her. She had loved the work, the thrill of being undercover, the purpose of gathering intel in hostile environments. And it stung to know that a couple of crooked cops had stolen that from her. But then she started to see the bigger picture. Her case had set something in motion that no single mission overseas ever could. Families who thought they'd never be heard were finally getting their cases reviewed. Judges were reopening convictions. Some men walked free after years behind bars. City council members approved millions of dollars in compensation funds. The police department was forced to implement sweeping reforms. Body cameras had to run continuously. Civilian oversight boards were established with real subpoena power. Performance evaluations shifted from arrest numbers to community engagement. It wasn't perfect, but it was change. The kind of change that came only when the system itself was forced to look in the mirror. 6 months later, Ryan Hale stood in a federal courtroom to hear his sentence. The judge called his actions a betrayal of the badge and handed down 25 years in prison. Derek Collins, who had cooperated, got 8 years and continued to testify against his former superiors. The police chief resigned under pressure, and several command staff officers faced charges of conspiracy and obstruction. Assistant DA Hensley stepped down too, his career crumbling under the weight of ethics investigations. But the most powerful moment didn't happen inside a courtroom. It happened outside, on the courthouse steps, when families of past victims gathered with signs and photographs. They held up the faces of men and women who had been framed, silenced, locked away. Danielle stood among them, not as an operative, not as a defendant, but simply as one more voice demanding justice. When reporters asked her what she thought of Hale's sentence, she didn't gloat. She said only this: "This was never about me. It was about a system that thought it couldn't be touched. Now it knows it can bleed, and that means it can change." A year later, Danielle was no longer in the field. She worked from a small office in Washington, heading a task force dedicated to studying how local law enforcement practices intersect with national security. Her job was to close the gaps that left people vulnerable, operatives and ordinary citizens alike. It wasn't glamorous, but it mattered. On her desk, she kept a single framed document, the court order dismissing her case. She didn't see it as a trophy. She saw it as a reminder of how fragile justice could be, and how close she had come to losing everything. Sometimes she thought back to that night on the quiet suburban road, the flash of red and blue lights, the smirk on Ryan Hale's face, the cold click of the cuffs around her wrists. And then she thought about the choice she made. The choice not to stay silent, not to take the easy way out, but to fight back. That choice changed her life, and it changed her city. Because in the end, true power isn't in planting fear in others. True power is the courage to stand against it, even when you're standing alone. And Danielle Carter, a woman who was supposed to be just another name in a police blotter, proved that one person's stand could shake the system all the way down to its foundation.